Hey guys, it's Mr. V over here doing a book review today for Richard Nixon, The Life by John A. Farrell. This, as the title describes, is about Richard Nixon and his whole life. And it covers from the time he was born up until the early 90s at the time of his death. And you can see it's a very thick book. It's a fairly thick book to where it covers all of Richard Nixon. And I would say that what's great about this book is that it covers all of Richard Nixon, because whenever we think of Richard Nixon, we always think Watergate. Yet it covers about his whole life and not just Watergate. I wrote some things down. It covers how he served in the war, his marriage and his family, the quick rise in politics, like how he went from Congress to VP in just 6 years, his 1960 election loss, his embarrassing loss as a California governor, him quitting politics, him coming back in politics, him winning the 1968 election, which is known as like the greatest comeback ever, the Vietnam and some of the secrets that went on, the Pentagon Papers, covers Watergate, visiting China, his resignation, and his later life. So you can see he covers a lot in this book. He writes a lot in this book, but the best part was that none of it was boring. It was all just amazingly written, and each part just had such interesting stories. Richard Nixon, again, a lot of times people just think Watergate, yet there's so much more. You just heard some of the things that he covers in the book. And this was a very, very easy read, and it was a lot of fun. Like, unlike some of the other big biographies, as you can see, again, this is a very thick book. And unlike other big biographies like this book just did not have a point that was boring. Some of the other big biographies can have like slight chapters which aren't that interesting. Yet this book just had amazing stories in each section. And that's what made this book so fun. And I learned a lot about Richard Nixon, because I had previously read a book about Watergate, and a lot of people know Watergate, but he just had so much more in Nixon. And it's just very interesting. Like, his political career is very interesting, because it shows how quickly he rose. Like, I didn't know that he went from like the House of Reps, like he got elected, and then 6 years later he was the vice president. And that was super fast, and just how he did it. And one other thing about this book is you not only learn about Nixon, but you kind of learn about like the life of a politician, because you see how they get their money and their support, like why he would vote some ways, like why they decided to vote some ways. And it wasn't just him. Sometimes he was talking to other politicians, and you kind of see that, and you see the dirty tricks that they play on each other and what they do. And the most interesting part is, while they do these things, they're still doing it for what they feel is best for their country. And it's very interesting reading it, to where I say, like, you not only learn about Richard Nixon, but you kind of learn like what is the life of a politician. And especially because Richard Nixon got all the way to the top, but you learn like what it was like when he was in the House of Reps. And that's also what made it very interesting, because other politicians are doing the same things. They're doing the same dirty tricks, and they're getting their support the same way. And he gives so many interesting stories in this book. John A. Farrell did a great job. Like, when Nixon, he covered like before his presidency, like it was fun seeing the political moves he did. It was definitely fun seeing the moves he did, because while other politicians do bad moves, I think Richard Nixon probably did a little shadier at times, because he did some really shady moves. And like how he got some of the secret donation money, and it is just a very interesting thing before his presidency. And you can just see while reading the book, like Nixon was just a natural politician. You can see that, because he knew how to play politics right from the beginning. But he made many enemies from the beginning, and that's another thing that makes the book very interesting, because you get to see like he made the enemies, but then how he just worked his way around it and what he did. And like I said, you learn many things, but something that was very interesting I never knew about Richard Nixon was that 2 years after he became the vice president, like he made it up that high, but 2 years after he became vice president, he wanted out of politics. He even wrote a letter saying like he wanted to be done. And he was done, and then you wonder partway through the book, you're like wondering what's going to happen, because he becomes president, but you're wondering like what happens, like what changed Nixon's mind. And you see that in the book. Like, you see what changed his mind. And despite wanting to be done in politics, it's like he went and then continued. And it was like he was almost done, and then he went on and continued he won 2 elections for presidency, you know? So it was just very interesting, especially because, like, in the 1960 election against JFK, he lost it. And you get to see, like, his fall, like how badly his fall was, that, you know, he lost the 1960 election, but then he went to run as a California governor, and he even lost that. Like, that's something you don't see often, where, like, someone loses the presidency and then they try to go run for a lower office and then they lose that, and then he just quit politics. He did quit for a few years, but then it's also amazing to know and see how in the 1968 election he came back and he won, which is known as the greatest comeback. It's like you go from losing the presidential election, you don't even win as governor, and then somehow just a few years later you come back and you win as the president, and you see all this stuff. So it was, like, just amazing to read that. And some of the other amazing things about this book was, like, when they cover, like, Vietnam, that was a very important chapter, because that's, of course, remembered throughout history as Vietnam is always talked about. But it discusses, like, the options he had, and, like, how the cabinet planned certain things, and, like, what had happened, and even something very, very bad Richard Nixon did to win the 1968 election, which I won't spoil here. There's something really bad he did in Vietnam. But it's just, again, it was very interesting seeing, like, they had released, like, what the cabinet said in secret, and how they debated amongst the cabinets. And it definitely helps knowing about the Vietnam War. So if you want to go into this book, I would say definitely want to know a bit about Vietnam. But it's interesting seeing, like, okay, what his cabinet said, yet what they said in public, and, like, the debates they had. So it was very interesting. And then another super interesting part was his visit to China, because no president was going to be allowed there. But the reason it was very interesting is because you get to see the secret meetings that went on for him to even get to China. There was so many secret meetings, and certain actions he took with other countries, and in relation to the visit, like, there was one country went to war with another, and he let it happen so that he could visit China. And, like, but he did not express this to the public. He just had to make it seem like at the time no one knew he was gonna visit China, type of thing. So he was letting wars go on, and these are types of things that, like, presidents really do. They have to, like, sometimes choose a side to meet the end goal or anything like that. And Richard Nixon didn't mind letting a certain war go on, and in public he's made it sound very different. That's why that was another incredibly interesting chapter. And of course, the book goes over Watergate, and that's also another interesting aspect, because it's one of the biggest scandals in presidential history, Watergate, and what had happened, and, like, what he could have done to possibly prevent certain things. And so that was also very, very interesting, seeing all that. And then one thing I really enjoyed about the book, again, you see it's a humongous book, so you can tell he covers a lot, but it was really cool how he explains his family life, and I really enjoyed that, because it shows that he was human. Because a lot of times we look at these people as, like, these mythological figures, the presidents, you look at them like, oh, you're, like, not even human, type of thing. But when he was explaining his family life, it showed that, yeah, you're actually just a human as well. And some of the things he messed up, and, like, the health issues, but how high strung he was, and the relationship. And it was cool seeing, like, how his wife felt, Pat Nixon, how she felt, and how she hated politics. Also because Richard Nixon was almost never home, but when he was home, he was just high-strung and super anxious, and how just it impacted his health and his family. And I'm sure this is the same for many politicians, that their spouse probably don't like politics and don't like them being in politics, yet they continue. And she's accepted. He went all the way to presidency. She didn't even want it to be a House of Reps. And then he went to vice presidency, and she was angry, and then he went to presidency, and she still stayed with him. But how much she hated it. And that's why it's just interesting seeing that, he was a human being, and just seeing, like, the true aspect of it. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book was that I felt the author covered Watergate way too fast. I'm not saying you have to go super, super in depth, but I felt he covered it way, way too fast. That I think he should have gone more in depth for certain aspects of Watergate. I knew a lot more about Watergate going into the book, which is why I knew this certain aspects. But I think he should have gone over certain aspects more, because I felt he just like quickly skipped over, not skip, but he quickly went over some certain big aspects, especially the tapes in Richard Nixon's office, which were crucial to Watergate and him being found out. And I felt that he just went through that way too fast. And I also felt that he let Nixon off a little too easily, because Nixon knew a lot more than the author made it seem like. Nixon knew a lot more than the author made it seem like, and that Nixon was a lot more involved in the cover-up than he makes it seem. And that's why I felt the author just let Nixon off too easily there. So that was the only thing I didn't like about the book. But as for his writing style, I thought this was very well written, and I think it was one of the best big books written. Because it's not easy to keep your attention for this long and to make everything so interesting and to make it he made it very easy to understand, and he kept you engaged the whole time. I was engaged in all the stories. I was engaged and never bored, and it was just great seeing it. The only thing you should prepare for is they are very long chapters, so prepare for that. They're very long chapters. But as I said, I definitely would recommend the book, because you basically see the life of a politician and a president. That's what you get to see here. You get to see the ins. A lot of the stuff was released. Secret stuff was released. So, you got to see the life of it. You got to see the secret meetings they go through. The stuff that's never released to the media at the time. How it's released 30 years later. You get to see what the meetings were like. And how much they do, and how much sadness they have to go through. But some of the stuff is necessary. And you get to see all that and the ripple effects everything has. And it's just very interesting. And that's why, I highly recommend, if you're interested in Richard Nixon, definitely pick up this book. But this book not only is about Richard Nixon, this is the life of a politician. But I highly recommend this book, as it's very interesting. If you guys have any comments or questions, please post it in the comment section below. Hope you guys click the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different types of book reviews. But thank you for watching today. This is Mr. V. Go enjoy reading.